Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about early 20th century activist and labor organizer Ben Fletcher, an African-American man who helped start Local Branch 8 of the Industrial Workers of the World chapter in Philadelphia. His opposition to World War I and the government's suppression of dissent at that time had Fletcher serve 3 years at the Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. Joining me for this conversation is Peter Cole. Peter Cole is a professor of history at Western Illinois University in Macomb. He's also a research associate in the Society, Work, and Development Institute at the University of Vitvatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He's the author of a number of books, including books on the Wobblies. His latest is called Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly. He joins us over Zoom. Peter Cole, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be with you and back on KPFA.
We're happy to have you back on and especially to have this conversation and to learn about the life and times, really, of Ben Fletcher and the connection to the industrial workers of the world, IWW, the Wobblies. These are terms that people who listen to this radio station probably hear frequently, but I don't know if we do a good enough job of unpacking what that means. I think we just sort of anticipate everyone knows who the Wobblies were. So maybe let's just begin there. So we have all of our bases covered. What was the IWW?
Yeah, actually, of course, the better question is what is the IWW, since it still exists. But it was founded in 1905 in Chicago, Illinois, which was then the greatest industrial city in the country, by hundreds of radicals of various different political and economic persuasions, but basically what we would call leftists. And those included people like Eugene Debs, the founder of the Socialist Party, but also before that led one of the most important strikes of the 19th century, the Pullman strike of 1894. Mother Jones, the socialist and union organizer and opponent of child labor, Big Bill Haywood, the most important mine worker in the Western Federation of Mine Workers, and Lucy Parsons, the anarchist and widow of Albert Parsons, one of the Haymarket massacre victims or executed by the state of Illinois in 1887, and others. And they formed because they hated the direction of the mainstream labor movement in the US, the American Federation of Labor. And the AFL-L's member unions basically wanted more money and better conditions for their members, both of which are sort of well-worthy goals, but they didn't have any larger agenda. By contrast, those who formed the IWW were anti-capitalist. They were very clearly believed that the system was oppressive, the economic system as it stood, and therefore advocates of socialism. They also sort of believed, because of their politics, that the AFL was mistaken in its approach to organizing workers, because the AFL didn't organize most women, didn't organize African Americans, didn't organize Asian and other immigrant workers, didn't organize most unskilled workers, which is to say the AFL intentionally chose not to organize most workers. By contrast, the IWW, but also other socialists, lowercase s, were anti-racist, even though they didn't use that term per se, because they believed that these sorts of divisions weakened working people and essentially only benefited the employing class. And therefore, workers were constantly being divided in order to be defeated, right? And so the only way, if you believe in socialism, as the Wobblies did, then you had to get over your hangups, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and racism. And so there were other differences between the two, but the only other I'll name is their name, the Industrial Workers of the World, right? Because capitalism was global, solutions to capitalism had to be global, right? You would, in other words, never achieve socialism in one nation. And so even in the 21st century, now we can appreciate perhaps more. We might think that, in fact, globalization is some recent phenomena, but they understood that, as did others, 115 years before now, right? Because they saw that corporations basically really don't care about what nation they are in, they care about their profits. And so the IWW was radical in multiple ways: socialist, internationalist, anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-xenophobic, and more. But that's a good place to start.
We're going to spend a lot of time talking about Philadelphia in the early 20th century. And what's remarkable is when you describe, and you were correct to say the IWW still exists. When we talk about the IWW from a little more than 100 years ago, they were a pretty powerful force, especially with the docks. And we're going to be talking about longshore workers and dock workers, especially with the docks in Philadelphia.
Yeah, so the IWW was very influential and had hundreds of thousands of members. Now it has a fraction of that total membership. But it also had actually members in dozens of other countries, right? And so they actually didn't just name themselves the industrial workers of the world. They actually organized across the Pacific, in Latin America, in Europe, and even as far as South Africa. But in Philadelphia, in the United States, where the IWW was founded and where it was largest numerically and probably most influential, Philadelphia, then the third biggest city in the country and maybe the fifth biggest port, was typical of American industrial cities, very diverse, tons of different European immigrants, many African Americans, in fact, the largest Black population outside of the South in 1900, many native-born whites, and an industrial boom, right? They made battleships, they made Stetson hats, they made textiles and clothing. And so that was the industrial economy is what is like a magnet, I always say to my students. It's drawing rural people from the rural parts of America, including Blacks from the South, but it's also drawing rural people from Southern Italy and Poland, right? For the same reason, right? Poverty. Right, of course, Black people fled the South, including Ben Fletcher's parents, because of the racism of the South. And although his parents probably left before the rise of Jim Crow, as it's understood in the 1890s, really the failures of Reconstruction by the end of the 1870s meant that African Americans, almost all of whom lived in the South still, were increasingly concerned for their safety, but also the failures of biracial democracy. And so were Fletcher's parents, who moved from Virginia, very likely had been born enslaved, although we do not know for sure, did what many later did in World War I and then in World War II, right, that followed, especially like in the Bay Area where hundreds of thousands of Blacks moved in the 1940s, right? But essentially a migration of similar sorts had begun several generations earlier, including to places like from Virginia and Maryland to the big city of Philadelphia.
Talk to me more about Philadelphia during the times of Ben Fletcher. Ben Fletcher was born in Philadelphia in 1890.
Yeah, so Fletcher's parents were part of the working poor, lived in what now is called South Philly. South Philadelphia would have had tons of Italians and Sicilians, many Eastern European Jews, lots of Irish and Irish Americans, and lots of African Americans. And it's weird for us to think about now, but in fact, cities became segregated where previously they had not been. And so we know for a fact by just looking at the census records, right, that Fletcher lived, for example, on streets in Philadelphia where white people lived, right? Later, that would change after World War I, right? And so Fletcher was being a young man. He didn't graduate high school, although he seemed to be very educated and intelligent, but largely self-educated, I'd say. And, he found work, right, in his mid-teens, right? And so we don't know when he first started to get wage labor, probably around 15 or so. That would have been normal for working class kids at that time, boys and girls. And there weren't many jobs, unfortunately, that Black men or Black women could get due to racism in the Philadelphia economy. And so thousands of men, immigrants, native-born Americans, white and Black, Europeans, found work on the waterfront because literally you could get hired by the job, by the day, by the shift to load and unload ships. And again, since Philadelphia was this booming industrial city, it was importing raw materials as well as some finished goods. It was exporting either to other parts of the US or to Latin America and Europe, all sorts of industrial goods, right? And there was more than 5,000 men who on a daily basis likely would have worked loading and unloading ships on the Delaware River. And those people generally were called longshoremen. Although nowadays the gender neutral term longshore worker also could be used, but at that time there were no women who worked on the waterfront.
It's interesting thinking about the workforce who were working at the docks and ethnicity and how the IWW would come in and kind of disrupt the dynamics that were at play. My understanding is within the dock workers, the owners would segregate people into teams, and it was based on ethnicity, and then they would end up pitting one team against another.
So that's a very good description. I would add a few points. One, all workplaces were segregated in America in 1910, for example, segregated by race and segregated by sex. And it's not until 1964 that it's even illegal to advertise jobs to hire based on race or sex, right? And so there were separate classified sections for male and females, right? As well as specifying we want a black person or we want a white person. That was in Philadelphia, that was in Oakland, that was in New York, not just in Atlanta or New Orleans. But like you said, in addition, in the workplace on the Philadelphia waterfront, employers intentionally hired and segregated and played groups off each other. So you might need 5 gangs of maybe 20 men each to load a ship, but you could have an Italian gang and an Irish gang and a Polish gang and a black gang, and you could play these groups off each other. And so remember that most of these immigrants from Europe actually don't even understand what race is. That doesn't exist in their home places. Division do, discrimination might, but not racism, right? And so they have to learn racism, and they do, right? However, what we've got in Philadelphia, therefore, is a workforce that's in 1913 when the Wobblies formed the Dockworkers Union Local 8. It's approximately 1/3 African-American, approximately 1/3 Irish and Irish-American, and approximately 1/3 other European immigrants. Generally speaking, that sort of demographics makes it hard for unions to overcome both the racism and xenophobia of society, but also of people themselves. Yeah, and so I don't want to only bash the bosses, although I'm happy to do that, right? But we also internalize these hates and prejudices. I obviously am speaking in America in the 21st century, where guess what? Racism, xenophobia, and sexism persist, right? And so the idea that can people overcome these divisions? Who created them, right? Well, employers created these divisions intentionally, and it would only, I suggest, be an anti-racist, anti-xenophobic union that could possibly successfully organize such a diverse workforce and then bring these people together to fight against these forces of hatred, even though that wasn't even their ultimate goal, right? I won't say it's a means to an end, but really actually they're anti-racist in order to get to socialism, right? But we can be very impressed in how this union immediately organized with a black leader named Ben Fletcher, leading, remember, a majority white workforce. So imagine that at that time, there were no other unions in America that did what the Philadelphia Dockworkers did, right? And only a handful that even tried.
Tell me about the creation of Local 8 of the IWW. This is in 1913?
That's correct. Yeah, so spring 1913, it was common after the winter where work was often diminished in northern ports because of weather, because the rivers would freeze and whatnot, right? But in the springtime, that was often when workers had a chance to basically go on strike because they could push the bosses when there's suddenly a spike in the work, right? And 4,000 men went on strike in May of 1913. Fletcher was already a radical. Fletcher already belonged to the IWW, already was recognized locally as a popular street speaker and organizer, and already had attended national conventions. But and the IWW organized in other industries in Philadelphia, but when these workers went on strike, it was actually common in that era. This is, remember, before the mid-30s when workers gained the right to unionize and strike. So employers didn't even have a legal obligation to recognize these workers and their union. That's why workers often had to go on strike. They would strike for union recognition as well as for a raise. And so in the spring of 13, 4,000 men shut down the port of Philadelphia for several weeks, right? Bottling up a key port and putting pressure on the bosses who let us remember the mantras of the industry: time is money and the ship must sail on time. And so with those sort of really commonsensical ideas sort of well understood by workers, they have power by stopping work, right? They only can do this if they are united, right? And so you need an African-American leader, but also actually Irish-American and Polish leaders, which they had, in order to convince everybody to sort of stay out, right? And of course, if you're on strike, you're not getting paid. And these workers generally lived paycheck to paycheck, which was the lived experience of tens of millions. And so it's very impressive that they went on strike. It's very impressive that they were able to sort of be racially and ethnically united. And it's after 2 weeks, employers basically conceded, recognized the union through an oral agreement, because the IWW never signed contracts. because signing a contract takes away your greatest power, because in most union contracts, there's a no strike clause.
Right.
But Wobblies don't want to give up the power to strike because they claim, logically, I'd say, that employers only respect worker power when they stop work, right? Because that actually hits employers in the pocketbook, which is really the motivation for business, right? Which is to make money, not necessarily to make a specific product, but simply to profit. And so, this is not unique. The Wobblies weren't the first people to figure out that strikes actually are powerful tools. They just sort of centered it in a way that actually previous unions had not. And even after they won, they continued to use strikes and the threat of quick strikes, maybe just for a single shift on a single ship, in order to constantly push the boss for gains, maybe raise, maybe sort of better conditions, but also to protect the power that they had won through striking, which is only hire our members, do it as we wish. And the last thing I'll note for now is that one of the changes they instituted immediately was they actually instituted integrated gangs. So employers had created segregation, and it was this union without a legal contract who basically started to dispatch its members in multi-ethnic, multiracial groups. That had, of course, proves that they have power. It also actually, I would say over time, is an educational lesson for the members themselves, right? Because how do they become less racist and less prejudiced? Through experience, yeah? And so when you work with someone and, they are also sort of basically like me, we have the same needs, we have the same enemy, we have the same chances of getting hurt on the job, and so therefore I have to watch out for you, right? Those sorts of material experiences are enormously, they're laboratories or schools, right, of anti-racism, you could say. And it was, again, 50 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? And so I like to point out that Local 8 pushed for integration against the bosses and against the state, and they did it half a century before the country caught up, right? And add another half a century because we still haven't actually achieved what they instituted without permission, right? As so-called working class people, right, did in 1913 and maintained for about a decade.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Peter Cole, professor of history at Western Illinois University in Macomb. We're talking about his book, Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly, which is now being published by PM Press in its second edition. Second edition because in the preface, you write that still 99.9999% of the people don't know who Ben Fletcher was. So we're very happy to promote the story of Ben Fletcher. And in that, can you talk more about maybe his role and more about was there just this split that occurred between the Wobblies and socialists in America and how Ben Fletcher fits in that?
Yeah, I could have probably added a few more nines on that 99.9 as far as unknown. I mean, Fletcher really is lost, although I hope to recover him. And I compare him often to Fred Hampton, right? Like someone who's actually now much in the news, but like Fred Hampton was killed at 21. Fletcher joined the IWW around 19 or 20, right? Both were African-Americans from cities outside of the South. Both believed in socialism. Both believed that you had to work with people other than Blacks in order to achieve that, right? Like famously, Fred Hampton promoted the so-called Rainbow Coalition in Chicago before being murdered in 1969 by the FBI and the Chicago police. Fletcher wasn't murdered, fortunately, but he was threatened with lynching on at least one occasion and was arrested by the federal government and imprisoned for his radical views. But Fred Hampton, of course, is very well known, especially by progressive people and African Americans, and Fletcher isn't, right? Like that is the way it is, right? Like, Fletcher, though, was part of the IWW in multiple ways. So, for example, the socialists took a principled stand when the US declared war in World War I in 1917 against the war, and Debs went to prison for that. In 1918, when he gave a famous speech in Ohio saying basically working class people will die for the rich, right? And this war has nothing for us. The Wobblies generally believe that too. Fletcher did as well. However, the IWW never took an official organizational stance against the war. that might have been because of its more anarchist tendencies, letting individuals decide for themselves what they think. But it also was an awareness, a very pragmatic, that the federal government already was targeting the IWW, and that if the IWW started to criticize the war, that it would be putting a big target on its back, and the federal government was going to go after the IWW. Sure enough, after the US Congress declared war in April of 1917, Congress then passed the Espionage Act that criminalized dissent. That is to say that if you verbally or wrote against the war, just criticizing entry or the operation, that was federal crime. Congress then added another law called the Sedition Act that sort of basically added more teeth to that. And so the Wobblies, including Ben Fletcher, within 2 months of the war being declared, the FBI doesn't exist yet, but it's called the Bureau of Investigation, which was still within the Department of Justice before becoming separate technically in the 20s, right? Like the FBI is already spying on Ben Fletcher as well as hundreds of other Wobblies, right? Even though they've given no reason yet to sort of demonstrate opposition to the war, what they have demonstrated is that this is a powerful, numerically significant group of workers who actually organize in many important industries that are strategic for the war effort, shipping for one, and that therefore, because they're anti-capitalist and because they're anti-nationalist, right? They're internationalists. They are not patriots. They don't like that word. They don't believe in nations. Nations divide working people from each other. And what was World War I? Working class Germans killing working class French people, right? And so they were therefore a threat, right, to the US management of and convincing millions of people to join the army. And so Fletcher and hundreds of other Wobblies were arrested in the fall of 1917 and the winter of 1718. And then Fletcher and 100 of his comrades were, or they use the term often, fellow workers, right? Were brought to Chicago in the spring of 1918 for a mass trial for espionage and sedition, right? What was actually the longest trial in the history of the United States up until that time. For over more than 4 months, 100 men, including Fletcher, the only African-American among them, right, were put on trial in a federal court in Chicago. And after the longest trial in the history of the US, within minutes, the jury came back all guilty on all charges. So all of them were sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, including Fletcher, with $10,000 to $30,000 fines, which you would adjust for inflation, you're talking about $250,000. And so there were also other groups of leftists who were persecuted by the federal government in this time period. Anarchists, communists actually don't really exist yet because the Soviet Union has just been born.
Yeah.
So technically the Communist Party of the US does not yet exist, even though they will later also be persecuted by the federal government after World War I and then again for decades, right? But really the Wobblies is the first group of people who were persecuted by the federal government organizationally, right? And that effort really, really weakens the IWW. When you take out the top couple hundred leaders and arrest a few thousand more, repression can work. It silences the most powerful radical union in the United States, right? At the peak of their power.
My understanding is the docks in Philadelphia during this period of time of World War I are really vital to the government's effort because many weapons are being shipped out. Did that play a role in this?
No question.
Were they specifically concerned about Local 8 because of this?
So yes, and perhaps surprisingly no. So Philadelphia, like other Atlantic coast ports, was where all the soldiers, but also all the supplies were being shipped, both to the British and the French allies, as well as for America's forces that in 1918. And I should note even one of Ben Fletcher's brothers was in the army. I don't know if he was drafted or volunteered, but he went to France. So Philadelphia was a crucial war port in the same way that the Bay Area was crucial, say, for the US war in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, right? And so, yes, Local 8's power is understandably a great concern to the Department of Justice, but also other so-called intelligence agencies, particularly the US, within the Department of the Navy, the Department of Naval Intelligence was also spying regularly on Local 8. Curiously, however, none of this evidence is introduced into the trial, right, if it existed. And subsequently, when there was an effort to get Fletcher and other Local 8 members pardoned, even the attorney general from that part of Pennsylvania, in other words, the federal agent in charge of their office, said, well, actually, we don't have any evidence that they disrupted the war effort, and you didn't ask us in 1917 or 18 when the trial was going on. The federal government prosecution just used the words in their magazines, often printed before the declaration of war, to say that these people are principally anti-war, and so therefore are a threat. But the prosecution never actually in Chicago introduced evidence against Fletcher, against Local 8 members, or even for that matter, the IWW generally, that there was some conspiracy to interfere with the war effort, even though it's true that most of them were probably anti-war in their hearts and minds.
Ben Fletcher would then serve 3 years in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. He was sentenced to 10 years. What do we know about his time in the penitentiary?
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. And so Fletcher actually became famous in 1918 during and after the trial because he made a number of jokes that were subsequently published in magazines and newspapers, as well as by Big Bill Haywood in his memoir, about the judge being not very grammatical in his sentences because the sentences are much too long, for example, right? And also Fletcher famously among the men who were, so these guys were all sort of then put in Cook County Jail that you might have heard of from B.B. King's live concert. But Cook County Jail is still the largest prison in America, right? And it was this notoriously nasty place, right? That also where the Haymarket martyrs were imprisoned and then executed, right, in 1887. And they were all there. Then they were all put on a special train, right, and sent 24 hours west to Kansas, right? And when they arrive, supposedly they break out in song, "Hold the Fort, for We Are Coming," which is a classic Wobbly tune, and the Wobblies were well known for their songs. Fletcher joins hundreds of Wobblies, anarchists, communists, pacifists, religious objectors, as well as so-called common criminals, Mexican revolutionaries, African-American soldiers who had been prosecuted for treason, for resisting racism within the US Army during the war. One famous Mexican radical named Ricardo Flores Magón calls it the University of Radicalism, because you can only imagine basically what the federal government has done is thrown together hundreds of radicals who have nothing but time. And so what do? Well, they hold meetings, they start book clubs, they start a newspaper, they of course correspond with people on the outside. Thanks to federal spies, I actually know who Fletcher corresponded with, who he received letters from, and who he sent letters to. Only because of federal spying do we have that sort of knowledge.
Really?
Right, about, otherwise, how would we know, right?
Where'd you get those records from?
Well, all you have to do is go to the National Archives, right? Or NARA.gov, right? Where after enough time, and sometimes you need a Freedom of Information Act, but often you don't anymore. A lot of this material is in government records, just that very few people other than historians would look for. And now with the internet, a lot more of these are available in digital form, right? And so you can find the Ben Fletcher prison record, right? That's how I know how tall he was, 5'4", right? That's how I know that he smoked, right? That's how I know that he ate citrus fruit, right? Because people would send him gifts because, of course, the government wouldn't provide fresh produce for its prisoners. But Fletcher was actually very modest. He didn't talk really about his prison experience much, but we know from other people who were in prison with him, right? For example, that these events were happening, that they were basically setting up schools. We also know, actually, this is not unique, that South African prisoners during the apartheid era on Robben Island actually were brilliant scholars and set up schools. We know in Northern Ireland, right, that during the Troubles that IRA members did similar things. Yeah, we know in Palestine, in Israeli prisons, right? So there's actually a history that's really not surprising when you think about it. You've got all these politically conscious people who have nothing to do, right, and are in close quarters. They might not have ever hung out with each other so much until they had suddenly years.
No choice.
They couldn't go anywhere else, right?
So this is all happening in Leavenworth.
Yeah,
That's
in this Fort Leavenworth, because remember, all these places were places where the U.S. Army had set up to fight the Indians in the 19th century. But there's a large U.S. Army base to this day, and just west of Kansas City, right, and east of Lawrence, Kansas. And so I've never been to Leavenworth. I've been through, I guess. It doesn't sound like a very lovely place. But the prison, it was the first federal penitentiary, right? And so therefore is particularly notorious.
Did anything come out of this when they were all in Fort Leavenworth?
Well, the answer is I don't, for Fletcher specifically, not to my knowledge. I mean, he comes out, he doesn't change his views, but he's mindful that if he commits another crime or is accused of such a crime, he could be sent back because his sentence is actually commuted, but he's not, it's reduced to time served. But those people who are still on parole have to then, well, be aware that if another crime goes up, they could be sent back to Leavenworth, right? And so strikes are still happening in Philadelphia on the waterfront in 1920 and late 1922. Fletcher's around, he's involved, and he writes about them, but he doesn't seem to have been as central. That might be also one reason that these strikes aren't as successful, right? Because Fletcher was considered to be a dynamic organizer who's organized up and down the Atlantic coast before World War I. But, and he continued to be a popular and considered to be a brilliant speaker. But Local 8, the Union, declines in power. And by 1923, the Union has lost control of the waterfront. You know, the bosses hated him, the federal government hates him, the city government hates him, a rival, more mainstream union hates him. The Communist Party has emerged and is looking to displace or co-opt the IWW by that time. And so, and xenophobia and racism have actually increased during and after World War I, right? And so the array of forces leveled against Ben Fletcher and Local 8, but more generally the IWW, are such that their power decreases significantly in the 1920s.
It's really in the 1920s that we get this second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, in which instead of robes, they're wearing jackets, dress jackets and ties and stuff like that.
It is amazing, actually. Although hoods were sometimes worn, there's plenty of photographs from the 20s of Klan members with essentially the pointed hats, but not covering their faces. Even, you know, for example, in the University of Illinois, where I live, in Urbana-Champaign, there was a KKK page in the annual yearbook of the U of I Urbana-Champaign, right? Because it was just considered accepted, right? Or in Oregon, where in fact the Klan had a major force in state government, right? In the governor's mansion, but also in the state legislature, but also back east in Indiana or in Pennsylvania, where the Klan had thousands and thousands and thousands of men and women, right? Probably few, if any, were in Local 8. I mean, because the Klan was not only anti-Black, it was also anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. And that's pretty much everybody who was in Local 8, right? Because if they weren't Black in Local 8, you were an immigrant. If you weren't an immigrant, you were Catholic, right? The Klan was really sort of white American Protestants, men and women. And so the Klan was around, was feared. And the Wobblies often sort of went toe-to-toe with the Klan, including in San Pedro, the port of Los Angeles, where in the early 1920s, there was repeated clashes between local Klansmen and Wobblies, right? In the sort of along the coast, but San Pedro, as it's pronounced, which is the port of LA, is on the coast, even though most of LA is actually 10 miles inland, right? But that was long also a hub, as was, of course, San Francisco. There was a significant Wobbly presence in the Bay Area in the 19 teens and 20s, especially among Italians, Russians, Jewish, anarchists and stuff. So North Beach, right, would have been the sort of the IWW stronghold in the World War I era.
So going in just before World War I, the IWW is a real force to contend with in this country. But because of the dissent, because of the suppression of dissent of World War I, and probably the Red Scare after, even though we see a flourishing in the 30s of the Communist Party, nonetheless, this is pretty much what could I say, defang, or at least, you know, incredibly hobbles the IWW?
Yeah, I think it's undeniable. I mean, historians debate, you know, was it 1917? Was it 1920? Was it 1924? And I think those are actually worthy discussions. But like the short version is government repression with massive support from employers worked, right? And so the IWW has this long coda, right? From 1905 to 1925, it's a powerful force in the US, right? from 1925 forward to today, it exists. Its ideas are still influential, I think, but the numbers of members are a fraction. And the communists would become a much larger force by the 1930s, the dominant force on the left in America, but worldwide, right? Through the end of the 20th century, that remained the case. And the IWW was radically diminished, even though in many countries, not just in the US, its ideas continue to hold sway. One example I like to give always is of South Africa, where the motto of the IWW, an injury to one is an injury to all, entered into South Africa sometime around 1910. It becomes the mantra of the most important Black social movement of the 1920s, which was called the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, led by a man from what's now Malawi named Clemens Kadalie. And then fast forward to the 21st century, and what's on the banner of most every South African labor union, including COSATU, an injury to one is an injury to all, right? And so the organization is smaller and less important. Other groups have sort of become more so over the generations, but their ideas continue to resonate deeply. And well, I of course only can hope that Ben Fletcher in particular, right? But anti-racist unionism, which is really pioneered by the IWW in the early 20th century, that is a thing, right? In the early 21st century, and ever more so, I think.
Well, tell me more about what are the ideas of Ben Fletcher?
Yeah, so one is really that the best way for ordinary people to exert power is workplace. So Fletcher wasn't an anarchist. He didn't categorically reject elections, and I'm not saying that anyone should or shouldn't either, right? But is that the path towards radical change that those who believe that such change is necessary? No. So in IWW view, it's really sort of workplace. It's economic power, right? And so that strikes is ultimately actually the path towards sort of building a new society from within the ashes of the old, to use the lingo, right? Whether you're believing in the necessity of revolution or not, where do people have power? Well, I can sort of point to Chicago, right? The Chicago Teachers Unions has done more to protect its members through the threat of a work stoppage than any other teacher union or group of teachers in America. That's why Chicago teachers this week are safer than they were before the threat, right? So strikes, which is to say also workplace power. And then that leads you into very sort of neatly into sort of, well, we have to sort of overcome whatever prejudices our society has and whatever prejudices we may have internalized. And so again, I actually generally think that hate comes from above and percolates downward, not the reverse, right? When Donald Trump speaks, millions listen, right? If I speak, fewer people listen, right? And so how do you therefore combat racism? You have to sort of do it, right? Because what happened in the last 5 years? Well, we were divided, right? We are still divided. This preceded Donald Trump, of course, right? He just expanded those, right? So Fletcher and the Wobblies would say, simply put, we cannot reject people based on race, nationality, sex. We could add, for our times, more identities. They weren't thinking about sexuality per se, right? Even though they are anti-homophobic too, right? But especially racism and xenophobia, those are so divisive, right? And it's not just unique to the US, right? I always like to point out to the history of the IWW, the first union in New Zealand to organize indigenous workers, the Maori, were the IWW, right? And so they apply that anti-racist tendencies globally, right? And at that time, there were socialists who actually were racists, who called for white Australia, white South Africa. So nowadays, socialists are better, I think, at rejecting racism. But historically, that was not the case in many countries. So Fletcher, through his actions and his life experience, but also through the union that he helped lead, are sort of, in a way, the best example of what they advocate for, like sort of multiracial militant union power, right? As the key to worker power.
So with
right?
the IWW, forgive me, would the IWW then in part get its anti-racist politics from Ben Fletcher?
That's a good question. Like, I would love to say yes, because I'm all about sort of saying Fletcher is so important, right? But, you know, it was before Fletcher. I mean, Fletcher was only 15 in 1905 when people formed the Union, right? And so from its inception, literally the first article of its constitution bylaws are, no one is denied membership based on race, creed, or color, right? And so Fletcher was attracted, I would say, to the IWW because it was already rhetorically anti-racist, right? And in some cases in practice, right? Fletcher's actions, and then the fact that these 5,000 men who were so diverse demonstrated what was possible and the power that came from that. They then, not Fletcher alone, right, sort of demonstrate that and are constantly being referred to within the IWW press, but also by those who are not Wobblies, but who are impressed by that. So for example, W.E.B. Du Bois, who later became a socialist, but in that era was not, he praises the IWW for being anti-racist. That only can mean Local 8. He doesn't name Local 8 and Ben Fletcher, but when he writes in 1917 about the IWW being anti-racist, the only example that's actually the most logical example would have been Local 8, right? Or when A. Philip Randolph and his buddy Chandler Owen form a Black socialist magazine called The Messenger, and Randolph later became a union worker leader in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. When The Messenger writes all about Fletcher and Local 8, right, they're praising. They're not members of the IWW per se. They sort of are part of the same current in the stream, right? And so I think it's clear that Fletcher and Local 8 expanded and demonstrated what could be done, but they didn't originate the ideas. I would give that to Lucy Parsons and Mother Jones and Big Bill Haywood and Eugene Debs, who also was pretty good on the race question, unlike many of the other white socialists in America at that time.
Peter Cole, I do want to ask you before we wrap up here about the suppression of speech in the 20th century. Again, we talked sort of what happened to the Wobblies during the period of World War I and just after World War I. The suppression of leftist speech would continue throughout much of the 20th century, if not all of the 20th century. Today, though, our conversation about speech seems to have flipped, at least to where today we see conservatives saying they're the ones now having their speech being suppressed. Do you have any opinions about that? As somebody who studied deeply the suppression of speech towards the left?
Yeah, well, I have opinions. I don't see that. I don't see actually, I somehow managed to hear many sort of right-wing voices all over the place, including in mainstream media sources. And so I am skeptical, right? I always like to point out that we are protected from the government suppressing our speech, right? And so as far as, does Twitter deplatforming Donald Trump? I don't know. That's a private corporation that actually is making a choice, right? But the government, I don't see the government actually suppressing conservative voices, right-wing voices, Christian voices at all, right? I actually see still the left, and I would include anti-racists in the left, broadly defined, as the primary targets of police persecution and government persecution, and show me historically, the evidence is very clear. When the government creates laws that sort of persecute people based on their views, the left has always been the target, right? Going back to really the espionage and sedition laws of World War I era, and the Red Scare, which we often associate with the communists, rightly so. Like I said, the first group of people targeted by the first Red Scare were the Wobblies. And disproportionately, Black leftists, both from Ben Fletcher, but then sort of taking that forward into the 1940s with Bayard Rustin, perhaps, right? Or for that matter, Elijah Muhammad, right? And then taking it into the 50s and 60s, same thing, Du Bois, Richard Wright, Paul Robeson, obviously the Panthers, but also SNCC, and even sort of, less revolutionary voices on the left who are Black, Angela Davis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? I'm not worried for conservatives. I think those are crocodile tears.
Peter Cole is a professor of history at Western Illinois University in Macomb, and he is the author of the book that he has joined us to talk about called Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly. Peter Cole, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
This has been a pleasure. I thank you for inviting me, and thanks to those who are choosing to spend time listening. I love KPFA and appreciate having the chance to talk to folks in the Bay Area.
And this will be on other stations as well. We are syndicated, so.
Awesome.
Thank you again.